The Wheaton family was the epitome of what everyone in the small town of Brookhaven considered the perfect family. Emily Wheaton, a soft-spoken, compassionate schoolteacher, was adored by her students and respected by her colleagues. She had a natural ability to connect with people, and her warm, nurturing demeanor made her a beloved figure in the community. Her husband, Mark Wheeler, had once been a top FBI agent, a respected figure in the world of law enforcement, with a reputation for cracking tough cases and bringing down some of the most dangerous criminals. He was the kind of person everyone looked up to. Mark had retired early from the bureau after a distinguished career, leaving behind the chaos and danger of criminal investigations to settle into a quieter life with his wife and children. The couple had 2 children, both of whom were successful and well-behaved, further contributing to the image of the perfect family. Their house, nestled on a quiet cul-de-sac, was meticulously kept, and their lawn was always lush and green. Emily and Mark often hosted dinner parties for their neighbors, where they would chat about local events, share a glass of wine, and showcase their well-rounded life. The family always appeared content and harmonious, their interactions marked by smiles, laughter, and the warmth of genuine affection. To outsiders it seemed as if nothing could possibly disturb the peace and perfection of the Wheaton household. Yet, behind closed doors, things were far from ideal. Mark, although outwardly calm and in control, had begun to change in subtle but noticeable ways. After retiring from the FBI, he found himself struggling to adjust to civilian life. The long hours of intense investigations and the constant adrenaline of chasing down criminals had kept him sharp and focused for years. But without the structure of his old life, he found it hard to fill the empty hours. The quiet suburban life that had once promised peace and stability now felt suffocating to him. He began to withdraw emotionally, spending more time alone in his study, going over old cases, and reminiscing about his time in the bureau. Emily, once the center of his world, started noticing the distance between them. She had always admired Mark's dedication to his work, but now it seemed like something was eating away at him. He became irritable, lost in thought, and increasingly detached from the family. At first, Emily tried to be patient, hoping that he would eventually adjust, but as the months passed, her frustration grew. The man she had married, the man she had built a life with, was slipping away from her, and she felt powerless to bring him back. Feeling neglected and isolated, Emily found herself seeking solace outside her marriage. She had always been a kind and compassionate person, but as her emotional needs went unmet at home, she started turning to other people for attention and validation. What began as innocent conversations with a colleague soon turned into something more. She found herself confiding in someone who seemed to understand her better than Mark ever had. The emotional connection she shared with this person grew stronger, and what had been an affair of the heart soon became something far more complicated. Emily knew she was taking a dangerous path, but at the time it felt like the only way to escape the loneliness she felt at home. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine when her marriage was crumbling around her. But the guilt that plagued her grew heavier with each passing day. She tried to hide her feelings, to maintain the facade of the perfect wife. But inside, the pressure was building. Mark's suspicions began to surface, and as the weeks went by, his behavior grew more erratic. His once calm demeanor had been replaced with an intensity that made Emily uncomfortable. What had started as a peaceful suburban life was slowly spiraling into something far darker than either of them could have imagined. Mark Wheeler's sudden disappearance shocked the entire community of Brookhaven. One moment he was there, part of the fabric of everyday life, and the next, he was gone without a trace. The evening he vanished, he had been out on an errand. Emily had last seen him at dinner, where they shared a quiet meal, though the silence between them spoke volumes. There was nothing out of the ordinary that night. Mark kissed her goodbye before heading out to run a few errands as he often did. But when he failed to return home by midnight, Emily began to worry. At first she chalked it up to a late work-related call or some last-minute task he needed to finish. She tried to call him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The hours stretched on, and still, there was no word from Mark. Anxiety turned to fear. Emily didn't sleep that night, her mind racing with thoughts of what might have happened. By morning she was in a state of panic, unable to focus or think clearly. She called the police and reported Mark missing, but at first it seemed like an open and shut case. People believed he might have simply gone for a drive to clear his mind, maybe even had a small breakdown after the stress of retiring from the FBI. Mark had been going through a difficult time, and it wasn't unusual for someone to disappear briefly when overwhelmed by personal issues. But as hours turned into days, and the search efforts turned up no sign of Mark, it became clear that something more sinister was at play. Detective Miller, a seasoned investigator, and his partner, Detective Harlow, were assigned to the case. They began by interviewing Emily, who was, unsurprisingly, devastated by the disappearance of her husband. She expressed confusion and sadness, but there was something strange in her demeanor, something that didn't quite add up. She was too composed, too calm for someone who had just lost their partner. The detectives began to probe deeper, starting with the most obvious questions. Had Mark been in any sort of trouble? Did he have any enemies? Emily insisted that Mark had been a model citizen, a retired FBI agent who had always worked for justice. He had no known enemies, she claimed, and had no reason to disappear. Yet, as they spoke with neighbors and friends, a different story started to emerge. Mark had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. He had become increasingly withdrawn, obsessed with something he had discovered about his own life, but no one knew what. Some reported hearing Mark muttering to himself about being watched, while others said he had been on edge, pacing the house late at night as if something was bothering him. Detective Miller and Harlow dug deeper into Mark's past, going through his records from his time in the FBI. They found that he had been involved in some of the Bureau's most high-stakes operations, many of them dealing with organized crime and corruption. His retirement, it seemed, had been prompted by a desire to distance himself from the pressure of his old life. But as they sifted through the files, they discovered that Mark had been secretly investigating someone closer to home. His investigation had led him to believe that the woman he loved, his wife Emily, might be involved in something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The detectives were beginning to see cracks in Emily's story. They felt there was more to her calm, controlled exterior than she was letting on. Emily had been carefully monitoring the investigation, and her responses seemed rehearsed, as if she had already anticipated the questions they would ask. Every answer she gave was calm and collected, but the deeper they dug, the more unsettling it became. Emily had a secret, one that she wasn't ready to reveal, and as the investigation continued, the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that the woman they were looking at might know far more than she was letting on about her husband's disappearance. Something wasn't right, and they were determined to find out what it was. The investigation into Mark Wheeler's disappearance took a dramatic turn when a tip came in that led Detective Miller and his partner, Detective Harlow, to an isolated cabin deep in the woods, far from the quiet suburbs of Brookhaven. It wasn't the kind of place one would expect to find a clue connected to a missing person. But something about the location felt important. The tip had been vague, but it was enough to urge the detectives to act. The cabin had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up, and its structure rotting from the inside out. However, inside, they discovered something that would forever change the course of the investigation. A journal. The pages, yellowed with age, were marked with handwritten entries that appeared to belong to Mark. As the detectives flipped through the pages, they discovered a chilling account of his life over the past few months, filled with disturbing observations and startling revelations. Mark had been growing increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone was watching him. The more the detectives read, the clearer it became that Mark had been onto something much bigger than anyone had initially suspected. The journal detailed his suspicions that Emily, his wife, was involved in something far darker than he could have imagined. Mark had always been a man of integrity, dedicated to his work, and even in retirement, he couldn't shake the instincts that had made him a skilled FBI agent. His suspicions about Emily had started to build after he had stumbled upon a series of strange, cryptic messages in their home. These messages, written in code, seemed to be linked to an underground network of criminals. Mark had begun to believe that Emily, his loving wife, was hiding something dangerous. The journal entries were filled with frustration, as Mark wrote about his attempts to confront Emily. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow connected to a network of criminals, and his fears were growing by the day. But what disturbed the detectives even more was Mark's increasing belief that his own life was in danger. He feared for his safety and wrote about a sense of impending doom, as though he was being hunted. As the journal entries became more erratic, the detectives pieced together the horrifying truth. Mark's investigation had led him dangerously close to discovering the extent of his wife's involvement in criminal activities. As the journal came to an end, there was a final, unsettling entry that left the detectives with more questions than answers. Mark had written about a confrontation he'd had with Emily's father, a retired FBI agent himself, whom he had grown to distrust. Mark believed that Emily's father was deeply involved in the same criminal syndicate he had been investigating. The journal ended abruptly, as though Mark had been interrupted mid-thought, and there was no further mention of what had happened after that. The detectives knew they had to follow this new lead. They immediately contacted Emily's father, a once respected former agent who had long since retired from the FBI. He lived in a quiet, secluded area not far from the cabin, and as they delved deeper into his past, they uncovered troubling connections. Emily's father had been involved in several questionable activities after his retirement. His ties to criminal networks were subtle, but undeniable. The more the detectives uncovered, the clearer it became that Emily and her father shared a dark secret, a secret that could explain why Mark had disappeared and why he had been so desperate to uncover the truth. When forensic evidence from the cabin was analyzed, it only confirmed their suspicions. Blood stains found on the floor matched Mark's DNA. A discovery that proved beyond a doubt that Mark had been there, and that whatever had happened to him, it had been violent. The cabin, once thought to be an insignificant location, had turned into the key to unraveling the mystery of Mark's disappearance. The detectives now had the proof they needed to take their investigation to the next level. What had begun as a simple missing persons case had turned into something far darker and more complex. The detectives were beginning to see a pattern. Emily and her father were not just connected by blood, but by a shared involvement in criminal activity. As the investigation moved forward, it became increasingly clear that Mark's death was no accident. It had been carefully planned, orchestrated by the very people who should have been closest to him. The truth, hidden behind years of deceit, was starting to surface, and with it came the terrifying realization that Emily, the woman everyone had once trusted, might have been capable of something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation into Mark Wheeler's disappearance continued, the web of lies and deceit surrounding his wife, Emily, began to unravel at an alarming pace. The discovery of Mark's journal and the incriminating evidence at the cabin had pointed the detectives in a chilling direction, but the breakthrough came when Emily's father, Richard, was brought in for questioning. A former FBI agent with decades of experience, Richard had always been a respected figure in the community, but as the detectives dug into his past, they found troubling connections that led them to believe he was far more involved in his daughter's crimes than anyone had ever suspected. The first sign that something was wrong came when Richard denied having any knowledge of Mark's disappearance. He insisted that his daughter was devastated by her husband's sudden vanishing and that there was no reason to suspect foul play. However, the more they questioned him, the more his story began to fall apart. Richard was evasive, his answers too rehearsed, and his body language screamed guilt. The detectives knew they were onto something, but they needed hard evidence to back up their suspicions. A few days after Richard's interrogation, the detectives received a breakthrough. They discovered a series of encrypted messages on Richard's old FBI computer that hadn't been wiped clean. A treasure trove of information that linked him to the very criminal syndicate Mark had been investigating. The messages, which had been buried under layers of old case files, detailed plans to use former FBI agents as informants for a powerful underground organization. Richard, it seemed, had been playing a dangerous game for years, using his position as a retired agent to help criminals avoid justice. The detectives realized that Mark's suspicions about Emily's father were not just paranoid ramblings, but a chilling truth. Richard had been using his insider knowledge to protect the syndicate, and Emily had been complicit in his dealings. It appeared that she had been more involved in the operation than anyone could have imagined. Her affair with a colleague was only the surface of a much deeper betrayal. Emily had been helping her father cover up his illegal activities, and when Mark began to uncover the truth, he had become a liability. The couple's perfect life had been a carefully constructed facade, hiding the dark truth about their involvement in the criminal underworld. As the evidence piled up, it became clear that Emily and Richard had orchestrated Mark's murder together. They had planned it meticulously, using Mark's growing paranoia about his wife and father-in-law as a cover. Emily, always the calm and collected one, had played her part flawlessly, ensuring that the investigation into Mark's disappearance would go nowhere. Richard, using his experience as a former FBI agent, had carefully staged the crime scene to make it look like Mark had simply vanished. The cabin, where Mark had discovered too much, had been the perfect place to hide the final clues. Blood evidence found in the cabin and on Richard's clothing tied him directly to the crime. Despite the mounting evidence, Emily maintained her innocence, insisting that she had no idea what had happened to Mark. She claimed she was just as shocked and heartbroken as anyone else by her husband's disappearance. But the detectives were no longer buying her story. Emily's calm demeanor, her well-rehearsed answers, and her knowledge of the investigation led them to believe that she was actively manipulating the situation to avoid suspicion. She had become the mastermind behind the plot to murder her husband, and Richard had been her willing accomplice. The turning point came when Detective Miller, having pieced together the final details of the case, confronted Emily with the evidence. Her facade finally cracked, and for the first time, the detectives saw the real Emily, the woman who had been hiding behind the mask of the perfect wife. She broke down, her cold and calculated nature momentarily giving way to a torrent of emotions. Emily confessed to her involvement in the murder of Mark Wheeler, but she denied any direct participation in his death. Instead, she claimed that it was Richard who had carried out the killing while she watched, too terrified to stop him. Richard's arrest followed shortly after, and he was charged with his son-in-law's murder, along with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Emily, too, faced charges for her role in the murder and her involvement in the criminal syndicate. The once perfect family was shattered, their secrets now exposed to the world. The detectives had uncovered a shocking conspiracy that went far deeper than anyone had imagined. A web of lies, betrayal and murder, spun by a wife and her former FBI agent father. As the case moved toward trial, the town of Brookhaven was left reeling from the revelations of just how far Emily and Richard had gone to protect their dark secrets, and how they had destroyed the life of a man who had once been a hero. The trial of Emily and Richard Wheeler captivated the town of Brookhaven. What had once been a quiet, picturesque community was now under the microscope of a national audience, all watching as the dark secrets of the Wheaton family were brought to light. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the prosecution laid out its case, detailing the chilling sequence of events that led to Mark Wheeler's brutal murder. The perfect family facade was shattered, and the details of what had truly been happening behind closed doors were enough to send shockwaves through the public. Emily, once adored by her peers and seen as the epitome of a devoted wife, now sat in the courtroom facing charges of conspiracy and murder. The calm, collected woman who had once seemed so sincere in her grief now appeared detached, almost cold, as she sat next to her lawyer. Her behavior, once scrutinized by detectives and the public alike, now painted a clear picture of a woman who had carefully manipulated everyone around her. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The blood found at the cabin, the encrypted messages tying her father to the criminal syndicate, and the startling confessions made by Richard were irrefutable. Richard, too, was in the dock, facing charges of murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The former FBI agent, once a respected figure in law enforcement, was now just another criminal in the eyes of the law. His involvement in the syndicate had been carefully hidden for years, and his role in the murder of his son-in-law, Mark, was chilling. The defense tried to paint Richard as a man who had simply been trying to protect his daughter from the dangerous world he had become entangled in. They argued that Mark had been a threat to the family's safety, and that Richard's actions, while extreme, had been a misguided attempt to shield Emily from harm. But the evidence against him told a different story, a story of manipulation, greed, and betrayal. The prosecution presented the damning evidence of Mark's journal, his detailed suspicions about his wife's infidelity and involvement in the criminal syndicate, and the chilling final entry about his impending fear of death. It was clear that Mark had known too much. He had uncovered the truth about Emily and Richard, and he had been desperate to expose them. His investigation, however, had cost him his life. The journal's last entry, written just days before his death, described his attempt to confront Emily about the syndicate, his fear of being watched, and his increasing paranoia about the threat against him. The final lines of his journal, "I'm not sure if I'll make it through tonight," had sent chills down the spine of every person who read them. As the trial progressed, a key moment came when Emily was forced to take the stand. Her cold and calculated demeanor mainly cracked under the weight of the evidence. Faced with the truth of her husband's suspicions and the undeniable proof of her involvement, Emily confessed to her role in the plot to murder Mark. But her confession was not one of remorse. Instead, she claimed that she had been forced into it by her father, a man she described as domineering and controlling. She admitted to knowing that Mark was getting too close to uncovering the truth, and that she had been involved in helping him disappear, but she denied being directly involved in the killing. Instead, she claimed that Richard had acted alone, driven by fear of what Mark would expose. Richard's response in court was equally chilling. He showed little emotion as the prosecution presented evidence that linked him directly to the crime. The once proud former FBI agent showed no remorse for the murder of his son-in-law, and in fact, he maintained that his actions had been necessary to protect his family. He defended his daughter, claiming that he had done everything for her, believing that Mark would have destroyed their lives had he uncovered the truth. But as the evidence mounted, it became clear that Richard had been just as involved in the murder as Emily, if not more so. The jury deliberated for hours, but the verdict was inevitable. Emily was convicted of conspiracy to murder and obstruction of justice. Her role in orchestrating Mark's death, while indirect, was undeniable. Richard was found guilty of murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The once proud former FBI agent was now a convicted criminal, his reputation destroyed. The court had found them both guilty of betraying the man they had once called family, and their sentences would serve as a grim reminder of the lengths people would go to in order to protect their own secrets. As the trial concluded, the town of Brookhaven was left in disbelief. The once admired Wheaton family was forever tainted by the revelation of their dark deeds. Mark Wheeler, a man who had dedicated his life to justice, had become the tragic victim of the very people he trusted. His death, and the subsequent trial, had exposed the hidden darkness lurking within a family that had seemed perfect from the outside. The case was a stark reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that sometimes the people closest to us can harbor the most dangerous secrets.